This is Ganyawe, the place that I previously did a video on, where I encountered individual that had told me all about an MK Ultra program running throughout the alternative communities, and that it had been doing so for many years, and there were many males involved in doing that. And he had also told me that by this stage that all the communities had been infiltrated, and that their job was to go in there and basically observe them, report back what was going on, and they would only stay there for a period of 2 years, as I explained in the previous video, but I'm just trying to give a summary here of pretty much what it took me an hour to explain, what I should have said in 5 minutes, but you wouldn't have understood if I did. So there was the person that I encountered at Ganyawe that was called Alan Hamer. He called himself the Jester, and he was the one that told me all this. And he told me about Frank the Birdman, who I also knew, and other people I didn't know, who was Chris, and Brett the Spider, and Paul, who was the trainer, our psychic remote viewer that would take them, and when I say them, because he wasn't the only one, as he was telling me, there were all these others, that would take them back in for their 8 weeks training every 2 years, because the programming that they've, I suppose, as I explained in the other video, it's probably because of the old techniques that were used on them years ago. These are MK Ultra, not the Super Soldier MK Ultra, but the older version, I suppose, where the younger version, they tweaked things and so that the programming wouldn't break down as much, and that the personas that they were carrying on with were more entrenched as a reality with this person, so that they couldn't break through and actually start to get confused, because, you know, this is where a lot of them would end up in a mental institution claiming split personalities, because that's essentially what has happened, that the full main ultra personality is breaking down and allowing other personalities, maybe even the real personality, to come through. But you don't know which personality is going to come through once it starts breaking down. Now, these people have a certain level of... Alright, I'm not going to go any further in that area, because yesterday, well, the last video I did on it, I realised that I was talking about the experience that I had here at Ganyawe and the individual that I encountered all those years, well, 6 years ago, and the individual that I encountered recently, that everything that I've seen, even the connection that this person is also connected to Byron Bay. Now, at this community at Ganyawe, and there used to be other people that would drop in every day from all over different places. There were people from other communities, friends that they knew that weren't from communities but they just had in the area or somewhere else. And also on the odd occasion you would have woofers come in. Now, I'll explain woofers in a minute, because I don't want to get off the subject here. I've already forgotten what I was talking about. That's right, I was getting at the confusion I might have created in my previous video, because I didn't clearly distinguish between the person that had made me remember this experience because of all the boxes they ticked. And it wasn't just... I mean, Byron Bay on its own, I mean, it's a strange place in this larger northern New South Wales region, that there are people that there's always something that seems to be going on at Byron Bay, and I never went there because I went there years ago, and it's like many other places with shrubby bush and sand, and there's not much there. It's just, I really didn't see what people found appealing about it. I know that in summer that it swells out with lots of beachgoers and stuff like that, but then lots of places do. So, and that's not appealing to me, to have it swell out with lots of people. I'm more your recluse rather than your party crowd goer. So there's this connection to Byron Bay, and there's also the connection to Byron Bay of the celebrities. I mean, they love to buy land as their Australia retreat, you know. There's just some sort of connection about Byron Bay to all of these communities that I just don't understand, never got, but it was also because of that it's, when I hear someone say that they were in Byron Bay and that they've lived a particular lifestyle, they've done certain things, and then when I've observed enough of their conversation and their reactions to when people challenge them too. I mean, this individual that I'm talking about that I encountered recently, he is a very good presenter if he speaks on his own. And I agree with so much of what he's saying. But if you put him in an environment where he is with other people, he tends to dominate the conversation, and he doesn't like to be challenged on what he's saying. And he will make an argument over what I do consider very petty things. Now, if I actually brought this out to that person, I've seen it happen enough times I've looked all through YouTube and other places I've found YouTube videos, and I've seen at least 3 instances where he's had falling out with people, and they've had him unleash a torrent of anger about how he feels about them, and he accuses them of all these things and says he will, you know, gladly debate it, or, oh no, they're not worth it, I've long written them off, they're not even worth debating it. But this is the form of, you know, retort he has back to something. It's not a debate, it's not a conversation, it's an attack. And that attack is a defense mechanism that I also believe is, when people say something, there's a certain amount of explanation you can put into something before it gets to the point, and it's not something you'll be deliberately paying attention to, but all of a sudden you'll think, you know what, I think thou dost protest too much. It's like you're trying to convince me of something too much. And that's when I get the feeling that this person, you see, when people have behaviours that they don't want to admit and they become defensive and attack, they put it back onto other people and make it about how they don't need to justify everything to them. Look, I'm not going to get into psychoanalysis here, because I've always observed human behaviour, not because I set out to, but because, as I say, that if you observe something for long enough and you meet people, see them for long enough, and you listen to them, you don't even realise it one day, but something they say might trigger something in you. It might be good or bad. It might make you feel good, or it might bother you. Now, the things that bother me, I ask, well, why does that bother me? And then I look a little bit further into it. And see, this person right now that I'm talking about in the present, let's just give him a name of Morgan. I'm going to give him a pseudonym on his pseudonym by a person that didn't like their first name either, Ian Morgan. He's deceased now. He was a friend of my mum's, and he was always known as Morgan. So I'm going to call this guy Morgan. So This Morgan guy has been associated with the alternative lifestyle community not only here in Australia but worldwide. And over the years he's made connections, and he's become part of a larger group of alternative thinkers, so that if there's something that wants to be achieved, that he's going to be a natural person to go to bring in, because they know that that person has connection to a large audience. And it's in that why I'm really saying something about all of this right now, because there is a global movement going on that is trying to coordinate people to come out into their own power. But if we have people telling the government when and where, we're going to be stopped. So if you have someone that's inside your camp that you trust and knows all this information and is reporting it back, no matter what effort you take, if you're not stopped, you'll be set up for something. They'll be waiting for you. So if you're not stopped and it's allowed to go ahead, there's a reason it will be allowed to go ahead, and that will have consequences. I mean, we know that the protests were allowed to go ahead so that they could be used to justify other conditions. And that's because there are infiltrators inside these, not only alternative lifestyle communities, but in the alternative news media. It is heavily saturated with controlled narratives. And most of the people that are predominant in these areas are controlled narratives. And some of them don't know it, but a lot of them you've actually seen that they've had at least one meltdown. I could mention at least 3 of them now that people would know their name, well, 2 of them at least, that people would know their names straight off. But I'm not going to name names, because in doing so, that then brings back them to lash out at me because I've got an opinion that they tell me I'm allowed to have, but if I have an opinion and call them out, it's like I don't know what I'm talking about. And there's this other guy in New Zealand that's associated to this Morgan guy too. What a loudmouth. He'll call you an idiot and all these other names if you don't agree with him. He'll even ask you if you know how to think. I mean, in some ways, he's running a slightly different program, but he's running a program. And he's also got a large audience. And like Morgan, this guy, I didn't come across him until a couple of months ago. And the connection between the mind control MK Ultra and the infiltration of alternative lifestyles and media, even the connection didn't come through then. But this Morgan guy, there's a connection, and if he's connected to Byron Bay, and if he's done what he's said he's done, and I know exactly that community, and I know that he's been around the same places I've been around, because, you know, this community where I stayed at is only part of a larger story that I haven't even gone into. And why I have known this area for years and years and years. And even to a large degree, how even before I went to this community, these people at this community didn't know me, but there were other people that knew me very well. So I do know the area, I know what goes on in it, and I also see that there's the shadow part of the society to it. Like anywhere you go, you get the glossary, you know, the glossy tourist brochure. That's the pretty version that you think it is, the ideal. That's what they want you to believe it is. But everyone knows that that's not reality. And that's kind of the same with these communities. They're all glossed up to look pretty, but they're not at the heart of it. So when you look at this community at Gunyawe, and it's not just this one, I've heard it said from many, many places, and also this Morgan guy says about the corporate structure of running Australia and everything, that we should not be run by companies and blah, blah, blah. And yes, I'll get a little bit more into that when I explain a little bit more about what a company actually is. But I don't need to tell you that they are companies, because they tell you themselves. As you can see right here at the very bottom of the Gunyawe ad, Alternative Lifestyle Community, that you get to sign an agreement as a tenant with the company. And it is a company. Now, I could tell you heaps about what goes on in these communities, but I want to try and stick to explaining a broad overview of... I didn't just suddenly arrive at this community one day and not know anything and only learn what I learnt there and then. There's a much bigger picture that, I don't want to make this a 10-hour video to get there. So I'm just going to chop through all that and get straight to the corporate structure of these alternative lifestyles. Now, I've said previously, there are hundreds of communities that are in the larger area, and they all have to register an ABN because of the activities that they carry on. And you can say that only registering as an ABN only makes them a business, but the thing is that once you register an ABN, that's the very bottom level of the corporate structure. So it is a corporate structure. The next tier up from that is taking it to a proprietary limited company. Now, just as with an ABN and as a business, if your business goes under, they can take all the business assets and all and anything that you own personally to cover any debts. Now, when you take it that next tier up to the proprietary limited company, the company is the entity. So if your company goes under, only the assets of the company can be taken, not the assets of the individual. Unless the individual used individual assets to secure a loan for the company, then that could be taken. It is a proprietary limited because it has limited liability and responsibility on the people operating the corporation, the business. Now, as I said, that any activity that goes on in Australia has to have an ABN. And I'll explain why a little bit, but I just wanted to explain to you that the first tier of it is to register at the very bottom of the corporate structure as a business. And then if you do not want to be held personally responsible for your activities, you then set up the structure where only they can only take the assets out of the business, not out of your personal assets. If you haven't used any of your personal assets to run the company and your company goes under, they can't take your house, they can't take any money out of your bank account, they can't sell off any of your assets to pay the debt. Only those assets that belong to the company can they do that with. So this is a level of personal protection that the people that run a company take on, so that, well, if it stuffs up, I'm not going to lose everything. The person that only has an ABN, if their business folds, they could lose everything. So that's pretty much the difference between the two. A company can only lose what the company has, whereas just the ABN can lose everything that a person has. in another place I looked at yesterday, I was listening to a video that they did about buying into the property and everything. And they actually said that you would become a shareholder of the company, and that what you built there, like your house or anything, would become an asset of the company, or aka the community. And that sort of just raised a little bit of a red flag with me, because I thought, well, if this person that you want to come in and contribute money and buy into the company, and then they build a house, and that actually becomes an asset of the company. So if the company folded, that guy'd lose his house, because it's not his house, it's an asset of the company, or aka the community. Now they can paint it up and say it's an asset of the community, but in all legal purposes, they are a company and it is an asset of theirs. And this guy clearly said it, that it remains an asset of the company. He didn't say community. Well, he did say it afterwards, as I said, aka the community. So it is clearly a company and a corporate structure. And to allow for the buying in structure side of it too, the proprietary limited creates shares. Because when you have a proprietary limited company, you have to have at least 2 individuals or another proprietary limited company that takes responsibility that's behind that you can end up coming back to at least 2 individuals. So that's where your proprietary limited and your 2 individuals have a 50-50 share. Now, in the circumstance of Ganyawe, there were originally 3, so they would each have a 33.33% share in the company. Now, I'll take you on to the corporate affairs search of, this is there. You look up the ABN, you can see that it's Ganyawe Proprietary Limited. It's a private company. Click on that, we'll go to their ATSIC record. Here we can see that they are Ganyawe. Their date of registration was the beginning of 2017. Now, I've looked at this before, I know these documents are here, so I'm going to show you. So back in, there was 3 of them, so there would have been 33.33% shares amongst 3. And there was clearly a falling out, because one of the directors, Sasha's, disappeared from the scene. And so there were 3 of them, and it's come down to now only 2 running Ganyawe. And at the beginning of this year, this notice down the bottom here was the cancellation or forfeiture of shares. So they got rid of Sasha's shares. Now, I'm only assuming, because I'm not going to pay for a search to look at this. If someone else wanted to do that, you'd find out that these people are the people I'm saying, but I'm not going to pay to prove something to myself I already know anyway. So they've got rid of Sasha, and they've redistributed, as you can see in the next one above, they've redistributed the shares so that there's now 2 directors, and that would be Benjamin Smith and Daniel Smith, and their share is each 50 each. Now, in July, there was also a change or appointment to an office holder, which means that one of those people may have left and someone else come in. Now, you can't have, there's only 2 of them left, I'm assuming. They're running the show. They're not going to want to share the profits with other people. So they're not going to bring people in on that tier of the business. You can buy into the company, but they still want to just be the company. So this one here, knowing that you have to have 2 individuals in a company, they might have swapped one out, or someone may have bought into it and they redistribute it so that now there's 33.33% shares amongst three. Or there may have even been two. As I said, I'm not going to do a search. I'm not that curious to find out how they've split it up. So anyway, if I did do a search, you'd find out that at least here in this instance in the middle there, that there would be these two individuals left. Benjamin Smith, who we all knew as Hawk, and Daniel Smith, who we all knew as I-Man Dan. He liked the name. And there was Sasha that has disappeared from the scene, which the redistribution of shares would have been over. These Benjamin and Sasha were brothers, and I-Man was their cousin. And these three boys would sometimes get into raging arguments. Everyone would go for cover, and sometimes they'd get quite violent. And not the kind of environment you actually want to have kids in either. So if you're thinking about going to communities and you actually do have kids, mine were older teenage kids, more young adults. But if you've got younger kids, it's not a place that you would want to take them, because there's things that go on there that, seriously, if you didn't have a certain level of maturity to understand their immaturity, it'd damage you forever. Back in the 80s, I worked at this place called Dun & Bradstreet. I worked in Melbourne in the CDC department, which is the Commercial Collections Division. Now, I'm bringing this up because I've heard Morgan talk about, check out how Australia is a corporation, just go to Dun & Bradstreet and check it out. And Morgan's not the only one I've heard talk about this. I heard it years ago come out of all these other places. It's like, but Dun & Bradstreet is a credit reporting agency. They don't register businesses. If you want to look up businesses, you don't go to Dun & Bradstreet. All right. You may be referred to Dun & Bradstreet to get a paid report on them, but you can also go into the ATSIC office and do a search yourself and look at that company. And you don't have to go through one of these reporting agencies. You can do it for yourself. But as I said, they are reporting agencies. So going to Dun & Bradstreet and seeing that something is on there is not proof that they are a company. They are a reporting agency and a debt collection agency. Now, the part I worked in was debt collection, and there were other parts that were specifically where they would go and research companies, what they did, their corporate structure, who the people behind the business were. They would really do an in-depth report on them, and that's what people paid for. And there were other people that would just go and sit in the courtrooms every day and write down the results and come back and report on them. So they're a reporting agency and a debt collection agency. And in the collection part of it, part of my responsibility in the first job I had there was to go down and do the corporate affairs searches, which was what it was called before it became ATSIC. So I go down there and do all the physical searches. These are not searches online that we're talking about here. These are walking into a building where they hold the physical records, and you open up a folder and you read them. And everything that is about that company is in that folder. So that's what my job was to do. Now, you say, well, what if they weren't in Victoria? What if they were in Brisbane? Well, this is my job to do the ones that were in my area. There's a branch in every other state where they all do that. So mine was to only do what the specific physical records were available And I would get ones sent through from interstate to look up for them, because we need to look at the physical records. So you'd go in there and you'd have a look at all these different corporate structures and everything. You get a really good understanding of what's going on. So that's how I know what goes on behind it, and that Dun & Bradstreet are not the place where you want to go to see if a company is registered. That's here. Your very first port of call is your ABNs, your Australian Business Register, and the ABN stands for an Australian business name. Now, you have a look down the left-hand side here. These numbers here, if there is a proprietary limited, or if it's not just the first rung of that corporate level and just an ABN number, it goes up to a proprietary limited, there will always be 2 digits before it. Those 2 digits pretty much indicate, like bank codes do, where the record is held and what type of record it is. So that's a proprietary limited company, and the ABN number is pretty much those last numbers there. So all of these numbers that it's brought up look like they're all ABNs, proprietary limited. But anyway, so using the Gunyawe as the example, so as you can see here, that part there is just the ABN number. This 12 here indicates that it's got a proprietary limited attached to it, which if you go over to the corresponding record, that's the record number of it here. So if you look up here, it will actually show what I just showed you. That's the original corporate structure where it started from. And once it goes to that next rung up, it's got those 2 digits before it. I wanted people to be able to understand where you do search for records. Now, you're on the ATSIC site here. This is where, if the records held in New South Wales. Now, it shows you there that you could go into the ATSIC building and actually physically search the physical files of that company for yourself, or you can go online and pay other people that have done a report, and they offer information brokers down here. I don't see Dun & Bradstreet on there. They used to be on there, but maybe they're not as big as what they used to be, considering that everything's gone digital now. But Dun & Bradstreet are merely one of those information brokers that hold this kind of information already and keep up to date with it, whereby you can go there and buy that information off them rather than go to that physical office. Now, if you wanted to go to, like, say I'm here in Hobart, and I wanted to look at records that were physically in, say, New South Wales. Alright, so I'm going to go to my ATSIC bureau down here, building, and I'm going to go in there and I'm going to ask them to see the microfiche, because each office produces microfiche of all those hard copy documents that are then accessible by microfiche to the other ones. Now, this was back in the 80s, mind you, and I don't know whether that's still a current system, but there would still be that kind of a mechanism in place to be able to go through and say, well, look, I'm not at that particular office, but if I was, could you show me what I'd be looking at? So you don't need to ever involve any of these information brokers, because a lot of these information brokers will take the information that they've got and they will make up their own opinion on it. And if you don't know how to read the information that you get in a search, that's probably of benefit to you. But if you do know how to read a search, it's probably better to go to your own ATSIC office and search these records yourself, because these information brokers is third-hand information. It's not first-hand or second-hand information. So I haven't explained woofers yet, because I didn't get into too much in the communities. But I think the best way to describe woofers would be to just go to WolfNet and listen to this video. It explains that rather well. Now, that's the brochure. What I'm going to tell you is reality. I didn't know what a woofer was until I moved to New South Wales, or northern New South Wales. And I actually had that come up because it was stopping me from getting somewhere to live. You know, I wasn't a woofer, I couldn't live there. And it's like, well, what's a woofer? And a woofer is pretty much someone that comes in from outside of Australia that has to work a certain amount of hours in Australia each week, as required by law that the Australian government made, to maintain their visa in Australia. When this law was introduced, they pretty much allocated a whole industry to woofers that is no longer jobs that are accessible to ordinary everyday Australians. And also accommodation too. There are a lot of places that are set up where if you're not a woofer, don't bother knocking, there's no one home. And there's a good reason for that. And when you look at the video and it sounds like such a dream, and people come to Australia with that dream in mind, what they find is a bunch of people that are really, some of them might be good, but a lot of them, and I've heard stories from woofers themselves, many a story, and not many of them are very good. You know, I said, well, you know, you're telling me about the bad ones, but isn't there somewhere good you've been? They go, well, no, not really. And they try and think, but each one is just a variation on the last one. They use woofers. And these alternative communities, lifestyle communities, have got the right requirements to classify themselves to meet the requirements under the government legislation to be able to use woofers. And a lot of these woofers are used in alternative lifestyle communities. And when I say used, I do mean used. They are not well respected, and these people are not seeing the best face of Australians when they go there. And it really, you know, some of the stories I've heard, I apologise. I said, I'm sorry you went through that experience. I really wish that it wasn't what it was. But it is what it is. As I said, there might be some that are not taking advantage of the woofers. Now, mind you, when the COVID lockdown came in, I wondered where are all the woofers going? Did they go home? And I went looking around to see if anyone had said anything on it. And then I found a thing on ABC News where they'd done a story where people that couldn't get home, these woofers, had actually helped all the farmers and everything rebuild after the fires. So the whole time that the country's been locked down, these woofers have been helping farmers rebuild. Which I thought, you know what, that is a really great thing. That's kind of in the spirit of what this whole thing is about, what these people expected. You know, not what they got. And in some of the stories I've heard, what they got was criminal. A large number of these communities have become predatory. They are controlled by a certain limited number of individuals because there's a corporate structure and there are people that hold the power within that community, and they also wield that power. And there's a little bit of ego involved in it, perhaps a lot. And that takes, some of the pretty blonde European woofers that have come in, they're the ones that are especially going to tell you the stories that where they end up in situations where they're giving things they don't want to just to get out of the situation that they've found themselves in. When I'm talking predatory, I am talking very predatory. And this is all part of the darker side of it that nobody is really understanding is there or is even talking about. And I do think that it comes to this insidious factor of infiltration of MK Ultra elements that ultimately frustrate the efforts. And I'd have to say that a certain number of the individuals in charge of these communities are either related to someone that is someone or money or something like that. Like even these Smith boys, they come from money. If you looked at the property and you zoomed out, you'd see Smiths Creek Road. The reason they picked this property was because that was named after their family. You know, they like to toot it, you know, we're a big name, blah, blah, blah. And a few times some of their relatives came in, and yes, one of them's a lawyer and one of them's, they all do different professional things that are helping them, I don't know really what they were helping them to achieve. I know they were helping them to set up the corporate structure and everything to protect themselves from this property is millions of dollars. And you've got guys that want to purchase a property that don't have jobs and are living on the dole. Yeah. You've got to ask yourself, where's the money coming from? Well, it's an alternative lifestyle community, and the large part of the alternative lifestyle community is funded by things that grow in the ground and not necessarily all things that are legal. I mean, it's a cash crop. Some of the communities around the area actually have a legal license to grow it and are producing it for medicinal purposes. So yes, you've got a fairly big shadow industry that's going on. It's non-taxable, it's paying for things, and it's just pouring down with rain outside there now. Sorry, I got a little bit distracted. Because I know what I encountered in this community. Isn't every community, but it's a large majority of them. And I experienced at least 3 or 4 different ones that one was just one guy. And he came in and he went through our things when we weren't there. And we were paying money for somewhere where we couldn't even get hot water in the place. And when I said to him, you know, can't even have a shower, are you going to fix it? It's like, oh yeah, I will in a minute. He wasn't even going to rent to us because we weren't woofers. But because there were no woofers around, I think he had a bit of a bad reputation, but I hadn't heard of that. Clearly the woofers talk to each other and they steer clear of some people. And as I said, there were the odd woofer that came out to Gunyawe, but never saw him again. And I know why. Yeah. And there were some people that came out there, it's like, well, I'm not going to see you again because, you know, everything started out well and the boys were selling the place really well to them. And, well, one of them would be, and then 2 of the other boys would start in on an argument and there'd be a screaming match going on inside the house, and you can see this person raising their eyebrows and, yeah, well, okay. I wanted peace and quiet, and I wanted, you know, rational people, not a bunch of carrying on like teenage boys full of testosterone. You know, it does get to that really childish, masculine behaviour. And I noticed probably it more being a female, just how much it dominates the alternative lifestyle. And anyway, I've probably said enough about all of these things, and I probably haven't said enough too. I've probably missed out things, so I'll do another video and try and put those things in if I've missed them. But so I'm just going to add this little bit on because I forgot to say how things changed back in the 80s, and why I know that all these communities have to have at least the bottom rung of the corporate structure and ABN. So while I'm doing that, I'll just play the aerial view of Ganyawe. So back in the 80s, there were 3 different things that happened that affected things in different ways. Now, one of them was Alan Bond, and another was the Freedom of Information Act, and another was the GST. So back in the 80s, if you were alive then, you would remember that Alan Bond was a household name. He he won the America's Cup. You know, he did something that hadn't been achieved in so long, and so he was a hero, a national hero, and he was greeted as a hero everywhere he went. And that went on for a few years, you know, this America Cup thing, and you remember the secret winged kill that he was developing? Well, it wasn't the only secret he had going. And a few years down the track, after everything had died down and no one was really paying that much attention, they started paying attention to Alan Bond for a different reason. And one that you can look up easily yourself. He defrauded, he ripped people off. And one of the biggest consequences of what Alan Bond did was that they changed bankruptcy laws. Because when Alan Bond declared himself bankruptcy, he had utilised, that there weren't provisions there for any of what is there now, that he put all his assets into family members' names. There was nothing in his name. So when he declared bankruptcy and they went to take all his personal assets to pay any creditors off, he had nothing to take. So they changed the bankruptcy laws that if you have given away certain assets within a time frame, that they can reclaim those assets. So say, for example, that 5 years ago, a rich couple gave their kids, they bought them a property as a wedding present. And, it might have been for tax dodge reasons, because you can claim them as a tax write-off too. But they bought them this wedding present. And 3.5 years later, the parents one of the parents goes bankrupt. So because of the bankruptcy laws that exist today, they can go and take that house and sell it to pay off the creditors, because it was money that they had and utilised within a time frame on a major asset. So it involves major assets. It doesn't involve, little things like they're not going to ask for, grandma's chair or something like that back. These are major asset things. So that changed the credit reporting industry and the legal procedures that followed. Only if you were bankrupting someone to get something out of them. Those really hadn't come into play. As I say, these were things that were coming into play that would affect why everyone has to have an ABN. And the freedom of information was definitely something that had started coming into play when I was still working at Dun & Bradstreet, where there was a whole new level of approaching things that before you didn't have to go through. And that meant that the debt collection industry and the credit reporting industry had to modify a lot of their procedures to come in line with the Freedom of Information Act. So that was more specific to the industry though, not the actual requirements of the ABN. Now ultimately they were going to introduce the GST whether we wanted it or not, and the structure to hold that and monitor every single activity had already been planned to come in as an ABN. So they introduced laws that said that even non-charitable places that never used to have to register any kind of thing, every kind of activity had to be registered with an ABN if you were doing anything. And technically speaking, if you were a kid setting up a stall selling ice creams outside the, to the neighbourhood, you'd need an ABN so that you can be monitored for that activity. Every single activity has to be registered if you're making any money out of it. They even changed it where the second-hand industry was now taxable, that it wasn't enough to tax you the first time that somebody bought something, but you're recycling it and you're buying it for a lesser price and everything, but you're still recycling something. And the government says, well, the person that's selling it to you is making money and we want our slice of that. So this is where every single activity is monitored. Even your farmers need to have an ABN to sell their product. They can't sell a product if they don't have a recognised activity within the boundaries of all of these changes. Your sports clubs, your churches, anywhere that conducts an activity has to have an ABN. And that's just the way that they made the law back in the 80s. And that monitors the GST structure, because you'll see, take it here, the component of the business registry is, first of all, is your activity going to come under something that is classified for GST? Now, you have to employ a certain number of people and make a certain amount of money before you are going to attract GST. A lot of people will set up under an ABN to run their own business just so they can pay their pay-as-you-go tax on what they're earning. So it's not like they're setting up as a company and a huge business. Because they're working for themselves, they just need the ability to be able to pay income wage, the payroll taxes, the pay-as-you-go taxes. And if they earn enough money out of those activities to also register for GST and pay it through that ABN as well. Now, if you're a proprietary limited company, you're looking at tax credits. Now, I don't know anything about these tax credits. All I know is that if you're only at this bottom rung of the corporation, you're paying GST and payroll taxes more than you are getting tax credits. And those that are getting tax credits are also getting lots and lots of perks too. So they've really skew-wifted around in the last 100 years out of who's actually paying all the taxes. 100 years ago, the only people that actually paid all the taxes were those that produced an income, businesses that created a product and a profit. The ordinary man was not taxed for his efforts. And now the ordinary man is taxed not only for his efforts, but on everything he does. And a lot of these companies are getting out of paying huge taxes, especially a lot of them that have moved their head office overseas and they're working under foreign tax laws and not applicable to those in Australia. That's why you hear every now and again the Australian government tries to change those tax laws so that you've got companies that are earning major profits in Australia from Australian citizens, but all their profits and taxes are paid somewhere else. So it's one of those things that has been screwing over Australia without even considering the aspects that's happening today with... Well, I said it many decades ago that, there's no need to go to war when you can buy out a country. And I was saying that because I had noticed how heavy the ethnicity of the population had swung towards one direction. And also look on the corporate side of things, knowing how much they were buying into businesses and becoming a major stakeholder in Australian companies. And once you get to that stage, that's when it starts to get political, because most of these companies that are associated with all these alternative lifestyle communities are small and they're anti-political. But you're looking at the other end of the spectrum where you've got all your big known companies. That's when it becomes very political, because the people that own these big companies are friends with the politicians. They drink and eat at the same places, they move in the same circles. So ultimately the laws over the years have swung in favour of mates. And it's not your mate, it's the politician's mate who can well afford his dinner and his expensive bottles of whatever he's drinking. And he could even afford to pay $2,500–3,000 for a lavish hotel room for the night. Now, I don't know many of you out there that would even consider paying that much. Maybe if it was somewhere that you could stay for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, yeah. But a night, that's a lot of money. And that's where most of these communities are on a small scale, but in a different way they affect the mass population on a large scale. And that's why I've introduced all this corporate structure and all this talk of corporate structure, because I hear people talking about these things. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert. I'm telling you too now that this information that I know comes from back in the 80s. I have not looked at the current law. I have not heard of any major changes and seen any major changes occur in the way that things behave. Over the years, I have used the Australian Business Register. Yes, I use it to check up on people. Because any activity, as I said, even your sports club, your church down the road, the shop, you name it, anywhere that isn't just a person walking about doing something where they're buying something for themselves or their family, if they're doing anything, even if it's not for non-profit, any of your protest organisations, your environmental groups, I mean, all of these things have to have an ABN. Whether they do or not is, well, some of them, if you get caught out doing particular activities and you don't have an ABN, well then there's also a law for that, and there's fines and you get into trouble for it. And this is purely to monitor and make sure that the Australian government doesn't miss out any single possible opportunity to screw an Australian citizen out of every last cent of tax they can probably get you on. You pay payroll tax and then goods and services tax. And oh yes, I just got my electricity bill. And of course it's after the end of the financial year. Of course it's gone up, so you've got that pay rate increase that the government said, yeah, but add it on every year. It's not like you didn't pay for all this infrastructure and you need to keep increasing it. Well, how about you say that for 5 years you're not going to increase the price? You're not going to justify it. The costs have gone up because you've done some fandangled research that means nothing. Let's just for 5 years put a halt on it all and give people a break just for 5 years. It's already got to the stage where, nobody can afford electricity. You've got to take out a loan to pay your electricity bill off for a quarter. And that's tax. Every man and woman and child is so heavily taxed in Australia. We are the most taxed in the world. And we're sitting back taking it. And because of this great big stuff up that's happened ever since the beginning of the year, they're going to turn around and they're going to put that 10% up that little Johnny Howard said, oh, it'll never ever go up. Well, first of all, he said it'd never ever be introduced. That was a lie. He backpedaled on it. Then he said it will never ever go up. And I thought, yeah, well, we know that when a politician says never, that just means until it becomes convenient to do so. And we're at that stage where it's convenient to do so. And I heard them talk about it a few months ago, and it's like, oh, you've got to be kidding. We shouldn't even be paying GST. The government do not deserve a slice of our activity. Surely there is a limit to how much they can take from people. But people allow it, and they say, yes, that's okay. Oh, but, we've got to pay for all of this. The government are the ones that made these decisions. And the government that made this decision consists of a few individuals that put millions and millions into a certain position where now we're all in holes that how many people are going to dig themselves out of? Tell you what, the rich are still rich. They're not getting any poorer. But every other person is anyone that was sitting just comfortable, just, keeping their head above water, which is 99% of the population. You're now going down to the stage where a lot of people that you've looked at and you thought, wow, how do people get to that situation? And how is it that they get to that situation? I wouldn't get in that situation because I would control it and I would make sure. And I can't see how they say through no fault of my own. Well, here we are. Millions of people in Australia are facing something that the Australian government has done through no fault of their own. And something, we're facing poverty, absolute destitute poverty. And the government is not going to suffer for it, they're going to make us suffer for it. Not that we haven't suffered enough, they're going to make us pay for it. They want us to pay for their decision. And I say no. I say hold accountable the individuals that made those decisions and hold them accountable. Take everything they've got first, then see what's left. Surely there must be some law out there, considering that the Australian government has to be registered as a private company, listed on the it's a public company, listed on the stock exchange and all these other things. Actually, no, I'll take that back. I'm not sure whether it's public or private. I know it's listed for shares, and it has to be a company so that it can trade with other companies, because it has to exist as an entity to trade with another country. You can't just go, I'm going to trade with America or India or Europe. It's like, well, you have to trade with someone or something. You can't just trade with a country. That country, there's 25.5 million people in Australia. Who are you trading with? So that's why there's a legal entity that exists as our government. So they are the shareholders, title holders of the company that is running Australia, and thereby they should be held accountable and take what they have first before you start taking from the people that did not make this decision. And you've got to stop and think about that you did not make this decision. We're grown adults, and most of us would not make such stupid decisions that radically affect so many and not take any responsibility for it whatsoever. And even if we didn't take responsibility, the bloody government would turn around and make sure we did. They would force it upon us. So why aren't we forcing responsibility upon them? And yes, I've got off subject here. I was only meaning to come back in and explain, something that I'd forgotten about, because the whole corporate and company nature of it all, control mechanisms exist no matter where you go. If you go to these alternative communities, these lifestyle places, they've got a set of rules. At Ganyawe, you could see no pets, no cats and dogs. Now, when I was there were cats and dogs there, and there were cattle there, and there were horses there. Now, the cattle were actually pretty destructive because there were too many of them grazing on the land. But that's just my opinion anyway. I don't know whether they're still there or not now, but they say no cats or dogs. Now, that's also common to a lot of the communities around this area too. Cats, because they act as predators upon the environment. The thing was, where I stayed at this community, I had a cat, and I've still got him. He's a well-travelled cat. Sylvester, he's black and white and fluffy. He's a gorgeous cat. But he's got chewed. He really is, yeah. Anyway, so they liked him there. Why? Because for the first time they weren't having mice and everything chew through everything. And when Vess got a mouse, one of them said to me, "Is it a native mouse?" And I said, "I don't care if it's a native mouse. If it's a mouse, it's a dead mouse." There's a reason why there's always a farm cat. And these communities have completely taken away the safety mechanisms around food storage as well, with the failure to have a farm cat. Now, I come from farming stock generations back here in Tasmania, and there's always a farm cat. Every farm's got a cat. And most of them are sort of half feral. They're not a pet, they're the farm cat. They're only fed on scraps because their whole purpose is to keep the vermin out of the barn, to keep them out of the food storage area, to keep them out of the dairy, to keep them out of the chicken shed, and because all of these environments attract mice. And when you don't have cats, you've got a mice problem, and you've got a food contamination problem. And these are pretty big issues around these communities. Again, these are, as I said, I've missed out lots of little things that I could tell people about these things, but even the simple fact of there's always a reason why there's a scungy old farm cat. He's got a job to do. And if you don't have a scungy old farm cat around, I mean, he's too busy getting fat off the mice and having fun with them. They're so much easier to catch. Most cats will get bored with birds because they're often out of there too quickly, so they're not going to kill anything, you know. And I've had cats before that, well, they get cleaned up by most of the native animals out there. They don't fare well against the native animals, especially possums. I had a cat come back with a great big gash down the side just from a claw of a possum. So the threat that a cat actually offers to the environment is probably a little bit over-exaggerated by people that don't understand that. And even over the years where I haven't had a cat, I've always ended up with snakes because there are mice that get into the place, they chew their way through something and they end up in the walls. You don't know they're there, but a snake can smell them. I mean, there was a place on the Gold Coast that, right in suburbia, this huge bloody black snake. I couldn't believe it. And just a minute before that, there were kids running around in that lounge room. And it had come in because I thought, wow, it had gone along the corner of the wall, and I followed it to behind the TV, and there was a small hole there, and mice had chewed through to get into the house to food. And because at that stage I didn't have a cat, the mice had come in and the snakes had come after the mice. So not only do the cats keep away the mice and the health issues surrounding food storage, and I mean, they chew through wires, they damage plumbing, and if you get rats, what they can chew through, I mean, seriously, it's like they've got razors for teeth. So your good old Moggy cat is going to do a lot about keeping not only mice but snakes away. And that place too where I was at, where I didn't have a cat, I thought, all right, I'm going to get a cat. And I didn't want to get another cat because having pets makes it hard to rent a place. And I thought, well, I'm just going to make it easy for myself, you know, so I don't have to worry about it. But then I stepped out the front door there and, all right, it was a harmless green tree snake. But the fact was that if I'd had a cat, I wouldn't have seen either snake. If it was a venomous snake, I mightn't have seen the cat again, but the cat I've actually still got now, Vess. In the places that I have lived with him in Queensland, I've had snakes start to come in, and I've actually seen Vess pay attention, and it's like, what are you looking at? And he's looking at a snake. And I know he's going to go over to it, so the first thing I do is throw something at him so he won't, because I don't want a dead cat getting bitten by a snake. And it happened so many times that I'd call out to him, Vess, and he'd stop and he'd know I was going to pick something up. And the strange thing is that I am such a good shot that I would hit him every time with whatever I threw at him. It was like, no, he can't go near it. I don't want a dead cat. And he'd just step back after that and let me deal with it as best as I could with snakes, who deals with snakes. But anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. And everything else, just think about everything that I've said about the corporate structure, about alternative lifestyles, about people that are running a narrative within alternative lifestyles. And if you're out there trying to help fellow Australians and people in Victoria get rid of some kind of tyranny that's ruling over them, you need to be careful about who you're bringing in, because those that do have large audiences, they may be reporting back to the wrong kind of people, and you may find yourself in a situation that you can't prepare for. One way or another, the risks are real, whether others can see them or not. I'm putting it out there so that others, well,
Bye.